You know that feeling when you just want to go home, kick off your shoes, and pretend the world doesn't exist for a couple of hours? That's exactly where Jack's head was at as he drove through his HOA-governed neighborhood after a grueling 12-hour shift. But instead of finding peace and quiet, he found himself face-to-face with what can only be described as the suburban version of a bad cop movie. It started innocently enough. Jack was cruising down Maplewood Lane, his coffee lukewarm but still drinkable, when out of nowhere, a black SUV screeched to a halt in front of him. The car didn't just stop. It asserted dominance, blocking the road like it had something to prove. Jack barely had time to process what was happening before the driver's door flew open, and out stepped Mike. Now, Mike wasn't your average neighbor. No, Mike was that guy. You know the type, the self-appointed ruler of all things HOA, the guy who takes bylaws more seriously than his own wedding vows. And today, Mike had decided he was the sheriff of Maplewood Estates. Jack watched in mild disbelief as Mike strutted toward him, decked out in what looked like a Halloween costume for budget cop. He had on khaki pants, a polo shirt with HOA enforcement unit embroidered on it, in Comic Sans, no less, and a belt loaded with random gadgets that screamed, "I bought this at Home Depot." The piece de resistance? A shiny plastic badge clipped to his chest that looked like it came from the toy aisle at Walmart. "Sir," Mike barked, holding up his hand like he was directing traffic at the Indy 500. "Pull over immediately." Jack blinked. He was already stopped, because Mike's car was blocking the road. "But sure, let's go with that." Rolling down his window halfway, Jack raised an eyebrow and said, "Can I help you?" Mike puffed out his chest like he'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. "You're in violation of HOA regulations," he declared, pointing dramatically at Jack's car like it was public enemy number one. "You've been reported for parking too close to a fire hydrant last week." Jack tilted his head. "There isn't even a fire hydrant on my street." Mike waved off the comment like facts were irrelevant in his courtroom of HOA justice. "That doesn't matter. Step out of the vehicle so we can discuss this further." Now, here's where things get interesting. Jack wasn't just some random guy who lived in this neighborhood. He wasn't even just some tired homeowner trying to make it through another day without HOA drama. Jack was the sheriff of the county, a man who dealt with actual crimes like armed robbery and drug busts, not imaginary fire hydrant violations dreamed up by power-hungry suburbanites. But instead of pulling rank right away, Jack decided to play along. After all, it's not every day you get to see someone dig their own grave with such enthusiasm. "Look," Jack said calmly, "I think there's been some kind of mistake." Before he could finish, Mike reached for Jack's car door and yanked it open like he was about to make an arrest on cops. "Out!" Mike barked again, clearly enjoying his moment in the spotlight. Jack stepped out slowly, coffee mug still in hand because priorities are priorities. He towered over Mike by at least 6 inches, but Mike didn't seem to notice, or maybe he just didn't care. Instead, he launched into what can only be described as an HOA-themed interrogation. "Do you know how many complaints I've received about your property?" Mike asked, pacing back and forth like a detective who just cracked a major case. "Your lawn is too perfect. It makes everyone else look bad. And don't think I haven't noticed how your trash cans are always put out exactly at 7 a.m. on pickup day. People like you think you're above the rules." Jack stared at him, wondering if this was real life or some kind of bizarre prank show. "And another thing," Mike continued, now fully committed to his role as neighborhood enforcer. "Your mailbox doesn't meet ARC standards for decorative flair. It's plain white. The CC and RS clearly state that mailboxes must complement the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood." At this point, Jack couldn't help himself. He laughed. Not a polite chuckle or an amused snort, but a full-blown belly laugh that made Mike stop mid-rant. "What's so funny?" Mike demanded, narrowing his eyes. "Oh," Jack said between laughs. "Just wondering how long you plan to keep this up before realizing who you're talking to." Mike frowned but didn't back down. "I don't care who you are. Rules are rules." Jack sighed and reached into his jacket pocket, slowly and deliberately, before pulling out his sheriff's badge. He held it up so it caught the sunlight just right, a gleaming symbol of authority that instantly wiped the smug look off Mike's face. "You're talking," Jack said evenly, To the sheriff of this county. For a moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that only happens when someone realizes they've made a monumental mistake, but hasn't quite figured out how to fix it yet. Mike stammered something about misunderstandings and following protocol. But Jack wasn't interested in excuses. Instead, he leaned against his car and took another sip of coffee while watching Mike squirm. You know, Jack said casually after a long pause, I've dealt with all kinds of people in my line of work. Thieves, con artists, even a guy who tried to rob a bank with a water pistol. But you might be my favorite. Mike opened his mouth to protest but quickly shut it again when Jack pulled out his phone and started dialing. Who are you calling? Mike asked nervously. My deputy, Jack replied with a grin. I think he'll want to hear about this little incident. As Jack waited for backup to arrive, because yes, he absolutely called for backup, he couldn't help but marvel at how far some people would go for a little taste of power. Sure, Mike might have been annoying and possibly unhinged, but at least he made for one hell of a morning story. And as far as Jack was concerned, that coffee never tasted better. Jack leaned back against his car, sipping his coffee as if he had all the time in the world. Meanwhile, Mike was pacing like a caged animal, muttering something about miscommunication and unfair treatment. Jack couldn't help but marvel at the sheer audacity of this guy. Here was a man who had just tried to yank a sheriff out of his own car over a non-existent fire hydrant violation, and now he was acting like he was the victim. It was almost impressive, almost. All right, Jack said, breaking the awkward silence. Let's get something straight here. You said you're with the HOA enforcement unit, right? Mike stopped pacing and nodded vigorously, clearly relieved to have a chance to regain control of the conversation. That's correct, he said, puffing out his chest again. I'm responsible for ensuring that all residents comply with HOA regulations. Aha, Jack said, nodding slowly. And where exactly is your office? Because I've lived here for 5 years, and I've never seen an HOA cop car or an HOA precinct. Mike hesitated for just a second, a tiny flicker of doubt that Jack caught immediately. But then he recovered, flashing what he probably thought was a confident smile. We don't need an office, he said. We operate remotely. Remotely? Jack raised an eyebrow. Like, from your living room? Mike's face turned redder than a stop sign. That's irrelevant, he snapped. The point is that I have the authority to enforce HOA rules, and you're in violation. Jack took another sip of coffee, savoring the moment. This was better than any reality TV show he'd ever seen. All right, he said finally. Let's talk about these violations. You mentioned a fire hydrant. Yes, Mike said eagerly, latching onto the topic like it was a lifeline. You parked too close to it last week. Interesting, Jack said, stroking his chin like he was deep in thought. Because I'm pretty sure there isn't a fire hydrant anywhere near my house. Mike's confidence wavered for just a second before he doubled down. Well, maybe it wasn't a fire hydrant exactly, he said quickly, but it was definitely something important. A mailbox. Yes, you parked too close to someone's mailbox. Jack couldn't help but laugh at this point. A deep, hearty laugh that echoed through the quiet suburban street. A mailbox? He repeated, shaking his head. You're telling me you blocked my car in the middle of the road because of a mailbox? It's not just about the mailbox, Mike sputtered, clearly flustered now. It's about maintaining order in the community. If we let one person break the rules, then everyone will think they can do whatever they want. It'll be chaos. Jack stared at him for a long moment, trying to decide whether this guy was delusional or just really committed to his role as self-appointed neighborhood enforcer. Either way, it didn't matter. Jack had had enough. All right, Jack said finally, setting his coffee mug down on the roof of his car. Let's settle this once and for all. Mike looked hopeful for a moment, like maybe Jack was about to admit defeat and grovel for forgiveness. But that hope quickly faded when Jack pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of Mike's SUV. What are you doing? Mike demanded. Oh, just documenting this little encounter, Jack said casually. You know, for legal purposes. Legal purposes? Mike's voice cracked slightly. Yeah, Jack said with a grin. See, Blocking someone's car in the middle of the road? That's called unlawful detainment. And pretending to be law enforcement? That's called impersonating an officer. Both of which are crimes, by the way. Mike's face went pale as he realized just how badly he'd screwed up. And let me guess, Jack continued, holding up his phone like it was Exhibit A in court. You don't actually have any official HOA credentials, do you? No badge number? No paperwork? Nothing? I don't need credentials, Mike stammered. Aha, Jack said again, nodding slowly like he was talking to a particularly slow student. Well, I hate to break it to you, but without credentials or, actual authority, you're just some guy harassing your neighbors. I'm not harassing anyone, Mike protested weakly. Really? Jack raised an eyebrow and gestured toward his car door, the one Mike had yanked open earlier without permission. Because I'm pretty sure dragging someone out of their car counts as harassment. Mike opened his mouth to argue but quickly shut it again when Jack started dialing on his phone. Who are you calling? Mike asked nervously. My deputy, Jack replied with a grin that could only be described as wickedly satisfied. I think it's time we sorted this out properly. Mike looked like he wanted to sink into the pavement and disappear as Jack calmly explained the situation over the phone to one of his deputies. A situation that included phrases like impersonating law enforcement and unlawful detainment. By the time Jack hung up, Mike was practically trembling. You don't have to do this, Mike said desperately as Jack leaned back against his car again. Oh, I absolutely do, Jack replied cheerfully. See, people like you are why HOAs get such a bad reputation. You think you can bully your neighbors into following rules that don't even exist because no one ever calls you out on your nonsense. Well, congratulations. You finally met someone who will. A few minutes later, a squad car pulled up to the scene, lights flashing and everything, and two deputies stepped out looking equal parts amused and confused. This him? One of them asked Jack, jerking a thumb toward Mike. Yep, Jack said with a nod. What's going on here? The other deputy asked Mike directly. Mike stammered something about being misunderstood and just trying to do his job as an HOA enforcer, but it quickly became clear that he didn't have any actual authority or evidence to back up his claims. Well, one deputy said after listening patiently to both sides of the story and trying very hard not to laugh. It sounds like we've got ourselves a case of someone taking their neighborhood watch duties way too seriously. Jack smirked as they escorted Mike back to their squad car for questioning. Not because they were necessarily planning to arrest him, though they probably could have, but because they wanted him off the street before he caused any more trouble. As they drove away with Mike in tow, still sputtering about mailboxes and fire hydrants, Jack climbed back into his car and finally headed home. His coffee might have been cold by now, but honestly, watching Mike get taken down a peg made it totally worth it. Jack wasn't the kind of guy to hold grudges. He'd seen too much in his career to waste energy on petty drama. But as he sat in his kitchen later that day, eating his finally reheated lasagna and scrolling through his phone, he couldn't shake the absurdity of what had happened. Mike, the self-proclaimed HOA cop, had gone full rogue, and Jack couldn't help but wonder how many other people had fallen victim to this guy's antics. So, naturally, Jack did what any rational person would do. He started digging. And by digging, I mean he pulled up the HOA website and scrolled through their bylaws like he was preparing for a court case. It didn't take long to find the section on HOA enforcement protocols, which clearly stated that only elected board members or their designated representatives could enforce regulations. Nowhere did it mention anything about self-appointed vigilantes with fake badges and a superiority complex. Jack smirked. This was going to be fun. The next morning, Jack drove down to the sheriff's office and printed out the HOA bylaws in full. Every single page of them, highlighted and annotated like a college student cramming for finals. Then he grabbed a stack of official complaint forms and headed back to Maplewood Estates with a plan brewing in his mind. First stop, the neighbors. Jack went door to door like a political candidate on election day, asking everyone if they'd ever had run-ins with Mike. And let me tell you, he didn't have to ask twice. Turns out, Mike had been terrorizing the neighborhood for months, maybe even years. There were stories about him issuing parking tickets for cars parked in driveways. Yes, driveways. demanding fines for unsightly Christmas decorations, and even threatening to tow someone's car for leaving their garage door open too long. "Oh, and don't forget the lawn incident," one neighbor said, shaking her head. "He told my husband we'd be fined if we didn't mow our grass diagonally instead of horizontally." "Diagonally?" Jack repeated, trying not to laugh. "Apparently it's more aesthetically pleasing," she said with an eye roll. By the time Jack finished his rounds, he had enough complaints to fill a binder, and enough absurd stories to write a sitcom. But Jack wasn't done yet. Oh no, he was just getting started. Next stop, the HOA board meeting. Now, if you've never been to an HOA board meeting, let me paint you a picture. It's like jury duty mixed with amateur theater and just a dash of middle school drama club. You've got the board members sitting at a folding table up front, looking way more important than they actually are. You've got residents scattered around in plastic chairs, whispering complaints under their breath. And then you've got that one guy who always brings up irrelevant issues like, why doesn't the pool have Wi-Fi? Jack walked in carrying his binder like it was evidence in a murder trial. He wasn't planning to make a scene, at least not yet. But he knew things were about to get interesting. The meeting started off as expected. Discussions about landscaping budgets, debates over whether the community newsletter should be printed or emailed, and one guy complaining about squirrels stealing birdseed from his backyard feeder. And then came the open forum. Jack stood up slowly, holding his binder in one hand and the HOA bylaws in the other. "Hi," he said casually. "I'm Jack Thompson from Maplewood Lane." The board members nodded politely until Jack dropped his binder onto the table with a loud thud. That got their attention. "I'd like to talk about enforcement protocols," Jack continued, flipping open his copy of the bylaws. Specifically Section 4B, Authority of HOA Representatives. One of the board members, a woman named Linda who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, cleared her throat awkwardly. "Is there an issue?" Jack smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that made Linda shift uncomfortably in her seat. "Oh, there's definitely an issue," he said. "Turns out we've got someone running around pretending to be an official HOA enforcer when they're not." The room went silent except for a few muffled gasps from the audience. "And I'm not talking about minor infractions here," Jack continued, pulling out one of the complaint forms from his binder. "I'm talking about harassment, intimidation, unlawful detainment, you name it." Linda blinked rapidly as Jack started reading off complaints like he was auditioning for Law and Order. HOA Unit. Complaint number 1. Issuing fake parking tickets for cars parked in driveways. Complaint number 2. Threatening fines for Christmas lights deemed too bright. Complaint number 3. Demanding residents mow their lawns diagonally instead of horizontally. By the time Jack reached complaint number 10, something about Mike trying to confiscate someone's recycling bin because it wasn't labeled properly, the board members looked like they wanted to crawl under the table and hide. "Now," Jack said finally, slapping the bylaws shut for dramatic effect, "I think we can all agree that this kind of behavior is unacceptable." Linda nodded weakly while another board member, a guy named Steve who looked perpetually confused, muttered something about needing more information. "Oh, I've got plenty of information," Jack said cheerfully, "including photographic evidence of your so-called enforcer impersonating law enforcement." He held up his phone with a picture of Mike standing next to his SUV in full faux-cop regalia. Linda sighed deeply before turning to Steve. "We need to address this immediately," she said firmly. Steve nodded like he understood what was happening, which he probably didn't, and scribbled something onto his notepad that looked suspiciously like doodles. By the end of the meeting, Mike's reign as Maplewood Estate's self-appointed sheriff was officially over. The board promised to send out notices clarifying enforcement protocols and reminding residents that only elected representatives had authority, and even then, only within very specific guidelines. As Jack walked out of the community center that evening, binder in hand and grin on his face, he couldn't help but feel satisfied. Sure, dealing with HOA nonsense wasn't exactly how he'd planned to spend his week, but watching Mike get taken down a peg? Totally worth it. Jack thought the HOA board meeting would be the end of it. He'd done his civic duty, exposed Mike for the fraud he was, and even got the board to promise they'd tighten up their enforcement protocols. But, as anyone who's ever lived in an HOA neighborhood knows, drama doesn't just fade away. It lingers like the smell of burnt popcorn in a break room microwave. And Mike? Well, Mike wasn't going down quietly. It started with an email. Jack was sitting at his desk in the sheriff's office, finishing up some paperwork, when his phone buzzed. The subject line read, "Urgent HOA matter." Jack rolled his eyes but clicked it anyway. Sure enough, it was from Mike, or rather, from an email address that screamed passive-aggressive suburban dad. HOAjusticeforall@gmail.com. The email was a masterpiece of delusion. Mike accused Jack of slandering his reputation at the board meeting and claimed that Jack had violated HOA bylaws by engaging in disruptive behavior. He even threatened legal action if Jack didn't issue a formal apology and retract his statements. Jack stared at the screen for a moment, torn between laughing out loud and forwarding the email to his deputy for entertainment purposes. Instead, he decided to reply because why not? He typed out a short message. "Dear Mike, thank you for your email. I'd be happy to discuss this matter further. Please feel free to contact my office at phone number. Sincerely, Sheriff Jack Thompson." Jack hit send and leaned back in his chair, waiting to see if Mike would actually call. Spoiler alert, he did. The phone rang less than an hour later, and Jack picked up with his usual calm professionalism. "Sheriff Thompson speaking." "Sheriff Thompson." Mike began in a tone that was clearly meant to sound intimidating, but came off more like a middle schooler trying to argue with a substitute teacher. "I received your email." "Yes," Jack said evenly. "What can I do for you?" "I want to make it clear," Mike said, his voice rising slightly, "that I'm prepared to take legal action if you don't retract your statements from the HOA meeting." Jack raised an eyebrow but kept his tone neutral. "Legal action? For what exactly?" "For defamation," Mike snapped. "You made me look like a fool in front of the entire community." Jack couldn't help himself, he laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a full-on belly laugh that made one of his deputies peek into his office to see what was going on. "Mike," Jack said after composing himself, "you made yourself look like a fool. All I did was point out the facts." "Well," Mike stammered, clearly flustered now, "you didn't have to humiliate me." "Humiliate you?" Jack repeated incredulously. "You dragged me out of my car over a non-existent fire hydrant violation while impersonating law enforcement. If anything, you humiliated yourself." Mike sputtered something unintelligible before hanging up abruptly. Jack shook his head and went back to his paperwork, thinking that would be the end of it. But oh no, Mike wasn't done yet. A few days later, Jack noticed something strange when he got home from work. There was a bright orange sticker plastered across his mailbox that read, "Violation Notice." Jack sighed and peeled it off, wondering what nonsense Mike had cooked up this time. The notice claimed that Jack's mailbox didn't meet HOA standards for decorative harmony and demanded that he replace it within 7 days or face further action. Jack stared at the paper for a moment before bursting into laughter again. His mailbox was plain white, just like half the mailboxes on his street, and had been there since he moved in 5 years ago. Jack decided it was time to escalate things, not because he cared about the mailbox, but because he couldn't resist poking the bear. The next morning, Jack drove down to the local hardware store and bought the most obnoxious mailbox he could find. Bright pink with glittery decals and a spinning windmill on top. It looked like something Barbie would use if she lived in suburbia. Jack installed the new mailbox with care, making sure it was perfectly level and met all height requirements outlined in the HOA bylaws, because if Mike wanted to play games, Jack was going to play by the rules. Sure enough, it didn't take long for Mike to notice. That afternoon, Jack heard a knock at his door and opened it to find Mike standing there, red-faced and fuming. "What is this?" Mike demanded, pointing dramatically at the glittery monstrosity on Jack's lawn. "It's my new mailbox," Jack said cheerfully. "You can't do this," Mike shouted. "It violates HOA standards." "Actually," Jack said calmly, pulling out a copy of the bylaws from behind his door, because yes, he kept them handy now. "It doesn't violate anything. The bylaws state that mailboxes must be functional and meet height requirements, which this one does." Mike sputtered again but couldn't argue with the facts. And besides, Jack added with a smirk, I figured I'd add some decorative flair since you seemed so concerned about aesthetics. Mike stormed off without another word, leaving Jack standing in the doorway feeling victorious. Over the next week, neighbors started stopping by just to admire Jack's mailbox and laugh at how ridiculous it was. Some even asked where they could buy one for themselves because apparently glittery windmills were trending now. Meanwhile, Mike tried everything he could think of to get back at Jack, filing complaints with the HOA board, which were promptly dismissed, sending passive-aggressive emails, which went straight to spam, and even calling local news stations, who ignored him completely. But no matter what Mike did, Jack stayed one step ahead and enjoyed every minute of it. By the end of the month, Mike had finally given up, or maybe he'd just run out of ideas, and life in Maplewood Estates returned to normal. Well, as normal as life can be in an HOA-governed neighborhood. As for Jack, he kept the pink glittery mailbox as a trophy, a reminder that sometimes revenge isn't just sweet, it's downright hilarious. Jack thought the glittery pink mailbox would be the final nail in Mike's coffin, the ultimate declaration of victory in their ridiculous HOA feud. And for a while it was. The neighbors loved it, Mike hated it, and Jack got to enjoy his morning coffee while watching people stop to take pictures of the suburban eyesore that had become a local legend. But as anyone who's ever dealt with HOA drama knows, peace is never permanent. There's always one last twist in the tale. About 2 weeks after installing the mailbox, Jack received an official letter from the HOA board. Now, this wasn't one of Mike's fake violation notices. This was a real, stamped, legally binding HOA document. Jack opened it cautiously, half expecting it to be a cease and desist order for excessive glitter. Instead, it was an invitation to join the HOA board. Yes, you heard that right. The same HOA that had been at the center of all this chaos wanted Jack to become one of its board members. Apparently, his handling of the Mike situation had impressed enough people that they thought he'd be a good fit for leadership. Or maybe they just wanted him on their side so he wouldn't keep exposing their incompetence. Either way, Jack couldn't stop laughing. I'm sorry, Jack said aloud to no one in particular. They want me to help run this circus? Jack considered ignoring the letter entirely. After all, he had enough on his plate with his actual job as sheriff. But then he thought about Mike and all the other petty tyrants out there who used HOAs as their personal playgrounds. Maybe joining the board wasn't such a bad idea after all. If nothing else, it would give him front row seats to the drama. So, against his better judgment and fueled by equal parts curiosity and spite, Jack showed up at the next HOA meeting and accepted the position. The look on Mike's face when Jack walked into the room was priceless. If looks could kill, Jack would have needed a full SWAT team for protection. Welcome aboard, Linda said awkwardly as she handed Jack a binder full of HOA policies and procedures. Thanks, Jack replied with a grin. Looking forward to keeping things interesting. And oh boy, did things get interesting. As a newly minted board member, Jack wasted no time shaking things up. He started by proposing a complete overhaul of the HOA's enforcement protocols, making sure there were clear guidelines about who could issue violations and what those violations could actually be for. No more imaginary fire hydrants or diagonal lawn mandates under his watch. He also introduced something revolutionary: transparency. Jack insisted that all HOA decisions be documented and shared with residents, so there'd be no more confusion about what was allowed and what wasn't. This move earned him plenty of praise from neighbors who'd been burned by vague rules in the past, and plenty of side-eye from Mike, who clearly missed his days as neighborhood dictator. But Jack didn't stop there. He decided to tackle one of the biggest complaints he'd heard during his door-to-door investigation fines. Apparently, Maplewood Estates had been charging residents for everything from unauthorized garden gnomes to excessively loud wind chimes. Jack thought this was ridiculous, especially since most of these fines were being handed out arbitrarily by people like Mike. So Jack proposed a new policy. Before issuing any fines, the board had to provide photographic evidence of the violation and give residents a chance to appeal. This idea was met with applause from everyone except Mike, who muttered something about coddling rule breakers. Mike, Jack said during one particularly heated meeting, if you're so worried about rule breakers, Maybe you should focus on following them yourself." Mike turned bright red but didn't say another word for the rest of the night. Over time, Jack's reforms started making a real difference in Maplewood Estates. Residents felt more empowered knowing they could challenge unfair fines and speak up about issues without fear of retaliation. The neighborhood became less about petty power struggles and more about actual community building, which was exactly what an HOA was supposed to be in the first place. Of course, not everyone was thrilled with these changes. Mike tried everything he could think of to undermine Jack's efforts, from spreading rumors about corruption on Nextdoor to filing complaints against Jack for unprofessional conduct. But none of it stuck because, well, Jack knew how to play the game better than anyone. Eventually, even Mike seemed to accept defeat, or maybe he just got tired of losing every argument at board meetings. Either way, he stopped showing up as often and started keeping a lower profile around the neighborhood. As for Jack, he kept his glittery pink mailbox as a reminder that sometimes you have to fight absurdity with even more absurdity, and that standing up to bullies is always worth it. So what's the moral of this story? Well, if you live in an HOA-governed neighborhood, or anywhere really, remember this. Know your rights, read your bylaws, and don't let anyone tell you how diagonal your lawn should be mowed. And if someone tries to pull rank with a fake badge, make sure they know exactly who they're messing with. Oh, and one last thing. If you enjoyed the story, and let's be honest, how could you not? Don't forget to share, comment below with your own HOA horror stories, and subscribe for more tales of suburban chaos. Thanks for listening, and remember, revenge is best served with glittery windmills.